Hello, Paul. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Miriam. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Yes, cannot wait. I listened to you on another podcast and I'm like, oh, I want to be in conversation with you.
Good, good. I'm glad to
Yes,
hear it. Good.
yes.
That's
So
quite
you're
an
talking.
honor.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And especially on the topic of having difficult conversations at work and with each other. I think that's something that we kind of all struggle with. And even as facilitators and coaches, there's, yeah, we can always continue to learn.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Happy to help with that.
Yes. Wonderful. And I always kick it off with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I definitely do. And I've had a parallel career. I've been in corporate human resources for about 3 decades. Until about 2 years ago, I launched my own consulting firm. But at the same time, Miriam, for me, I was teaching, I was writing. I'm a columnist for SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. I've written 17 books, either for HarperCollins or for the American Management Association. So I had my full-time job, which gave me all kinds of problems. And I untangled all those problems at night when I was writing. But basically, it's really been two separate career paths for me for the past 3 decades. So yeah, and facilitation is what it's all about. I love thinking of myself as a storyteller. And I think that makes the difference because writing 17 books, people are like, how do you come up with all the content? And I say, believe me, I'm not that creative. It finds you when you're in human resources. It just, he did what? She did what? And all of a sudden there's an article there, and you do so many articles and you have enough content for a book. So the narrative piece of it, the storytelling piece of it was always critical to who I am.
Oh, beautiful. And I can imagine that the content is coming to you and still the routine of bringing it to paper and to going through the process. I have huge respect towards that. It's
Well, people want to know, so many of these things are common. And in most organizations, and I've worked for good companies, I've worked for Nickelodeon and Paramount Pictures and City of Hope, which is a cancer hospital. I've worked for good companies, but the assumption is always that when you move into management, you just figure it out.
mm,
And you can let experience be your greatest teacher, but you're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way because things that you assume are not necessarily what goes on in reality or what goes on in the litigation arena. If you're ever sued, legally, there's a lot that's there. So I've always had a lot of content to share just to kind of, bring some light onto issues that people just never really learned. Even if you have an MBA from a top 10 school, they don't teach leadership in the trenches, as I call it. They teach you theory and organizational design, organizational behavior, organization development, but they're not teaching about frontline operational leadership. And that's what's missing out there. And I think that's where my books and my articles historically have kind of filled in the gap.
why do you think is that?
Well, there's a few things. Academics, nothing against academia, but academics tend to not have had, in general, real life experience.
Mm,
And because of that, or at least their real life experience is restricted to an academic environment. And that's not the same as what you see in the business world. So for me, what was important for me, and interestingly enough, the way I chose the companies where I worked, the industries that I've worked in, for me, entertainment, healthcare, biotech, and financial services, is I wanted to work across a broad spectrum of organizations, small companies, Fortune 500 organizations, nonprofit, union, international. To me, that always informed my writing. But I think a lot of times in the academic world, they tend to talk about theory and they're always at that 30,000 foot level, but you have to figure out what it's like, what I call in the weeds, down in the grass. You figure that out yourself because we've given you the theory that you need. But
mm,
that's why a lot of times, Miriam, what I say is the path of least resistance is avoidance. People do not want to confront their employees. They look the other way, they sweep it under the rug, they hope it goes away and fixes itself, but it rarely does. So you have to learn how to be able to approach people in a way that they'll listen to you and want to make changes for themselves.
mm. Thank you. This makes a lot of sense. And I wonder whether this learning how to approach people actually means learning how to be human. So there are certain things, yes, there are theories and Just before hitting record, I shared that I have a background in behavior economics, so how to measure human behavior and how to nudge people into certain behaviors or not. But at the end of the day, what it all boils down to is we feel discomfort, we have imposter syndrome, we're afraid of certain things, of failure and humiliation.
Yeah, that's true. And when I was growing up in my career, I would talk about soft skills, and we want to do soft skills training. And the people in the company would be like, get back. We don't want soft skills training. Go away. Now they call it emotional intelligence. And it's one of the top 5 things that CEOs are looking for in their senior executives and in their frontline operational leadership teams. It's the same thing. They changed the terminology. But the reality is, in today's environment where retention of employees is getting difficult, and so much of the work has moved to a remote, situation where either they're fully remote or they're hybrid, you have to be able to build relationships with people when you can't see them. When they're out of sight, it's more difficult. So they need to make sure that their frontline leaders know how to build bonds of trust and respect and interpersonal relationships. Well, thank you. 30 years ago, they called it soft skills. It's okay. It's the same idea. I think really where the bond to any company is more emotional than it is intellectual. When you love your company, more importantly, when you love your boss, when you feel like I'm working for someone who really brings out the best in me, who helps me do my best work every day with peace of mind. The expression we use in English is he has my back or she has my back. They're always kind of there to bring out the best in me. People aren't going to leave the company when they feel they have that kind of relationship with their boss. The question is, how do you make it safe for the bosses to be able to create those circumstances where employees can motivate themselves? And that's where I think the management training comes in. So that's what I've been focusing on for the last couple of years.
Yeah. And I think everyone would subscribe to that, right? We prefer working with people we care for, and being happy at work is so important. And you mentioned before the word avoidance, and especially with the remote environment, it's so easy to avoid the difficult conversations that then actually support the creation of these trusting relationships that you mentioned. And I wonder, how do you get to that you you don't avoid. Let me put it differently. If we want these good relationships at work, it's so easy to avoid the difficult conversations and to sugarcoat, and then we just pretend that everything was fine, and then the stress leads up or adds up, and we end burned out. How can we avoid this catch-22 or a trap, or however you want to call it?
Trap is a good word for it. So what it looked like in my world, Miriam, was the manager didn't do their job in talking to the employee. The manager gets frustrated, doesn't say anything. It gets all caught in their throat. And then some proverbial straw is broken on the camel's back, using that expression. Little thing happens and boom, now they come into my office in human resources that want the person fired. And I'm like, well, wait a second. What did you do to help? Well, Paul, I've talked to. No. The reality becomes this, Miriam. When the managers aren't doing their jobs, they can't expect me to do their job for them and just make someone magically disappear. In Europe, that's certainly the case. In the United States, there is a concept of at-will employment, but that doesn't really mean much in practicality. That's a theory that they use in the courtroom. You can't just let people go. But why is it so hard for people to talk? Because the reality is they don't quite know how to say it without fear of upsetting the person. So my logic has always been, teach your managers how to be able to approach topics in a way that employees can listen to it without feeling judged, without feeling offended, without feeling disrespected, and just talk to them. This is not that hard. We tell ourselves stories. Managers have these narratives in their heads. To be a good manager, you must be feared. Wrong. I worked for a manager once who scared me to death, and I couldn't chew gum and walk at the same time. I was always afraid of making a mistake. Throw that idea out. The idea of importance of recognition and making people, telling people publicly how well they're doing. A lot of managers say, I'll never do that. I don't want my people that'll go straight to their head. They're going to want more money. No, they're not. That's the psychic income that keeps people coming back and being happy at what they're doing. Call them out. When they do extraordinary achievement or extraordinary effort, celebrate that publicly. Call that to everyone's attention on the team. Make that person feel good about themselves, build their self-confidence. That's all this is. Yet at the same time, you have to have, again, I'm using a lot of English colloquialisms here, so bear with me, but the expression we use is you have to have a carrot and you have to have a stick.
Yeah.
The carrot is the motivator, right? But the stick isn't so motivational, but it hurts if you have to get hit with a stick. But the reality is you need both. I hope that 90% of the time you can motivate people using the carrot. But 10 to 20% of the time, you are going to need to use the stick as well, because some people just are not going to play nicely. Some people are not ready in their lives to be fully contributing. And so you have to know how to structure terminations. You have to know how to issue written warnings and those types of things. The books that I've written on, the one we're talking about today is called 101 Tough Conversations to Have with Employees, which is about how to make it safe for your managers to say things that may feel very uncomfortable, but they still need to say it, and they can say it in a constructive and respectful way. But two other books I have written, one was called Management Off or Leadership Offense, and the other one was Leadership Defense, using the sports metaphors. You have to have a strong offense, but you also have to have a defense. Otherwise, you're not going to have much of a team. There's both that are needed. And in the workplace, your managers have to have the self-confidence to know how to make themselves vulnerable in a healthy sense so that their employees feel like they can be vulnerable as well and trust other people. But they also have to know how to hold people accountable to a certain level of performance and conduct. So it's really both. And you can see just hearing these topics why you can write books on this stuff all day long. There's a lot of material out there. But again, I think my goal is to give managers back to themselves, is to give managers a sense of feeling like I feel confident in my job. I know I can do my job well. I know I can help people perform at their highest level. So that's in theory how I've always kind of focused my writing on the managerial audience.
Yeah, thank you. And it sounds as if, of course, the manager usually comes in with best intent, and they do need the stick, as you said, as a last resort. And then I wonder, how do you know, and how do you know that you have tried enough? Because before the stick should first come the difficult conversations where you actually try to support, try to understand. And for that, you need time and headspace, and as you say, the confidence. I think if the managers are already burned out and lack the headspace or the confidence, it's also very difficult to approach their team members without sounding aggressive or disrespectful or pushing. So what part is maybe mindset, what part is skill set, and what part is just like self-care?
That is a brilliant question. I love that question. What part is mindset? What part is skill set? And what part is self-care? And my answer is yes. That's the answer to that question, because it's all of them, Miriam. Let me give a quick example. A manager is dealing with someone who's a top performer in sales. They bring in 50 to 60% of the branch's revenue every month, just that one person. But that one person can have a toxic personality. Because they know they're bringing in all the revenue, they can be very disrespectful towards others and kind of kill team camaraderie. Okay, now you have to have a conversation with that person. You don't want to lose them because they bring in more than half of your revenue, but you want to come to them from the standpoint of career and professional development, not feeling judged. So if you use terms like, Paul, you always do this, you never do that. That's not true. Managers right away start to generalize and they use words like always and never, and that's not fair and it's not accurate, but that's their discomfort coming out. The wiser way to approach this is, again, to come from the career and professional development standpoint. So you can sit with someone and say, Paul, look, I wanted to talk to you one-on-one in private because there's something that may be missing awareness that can help you over the longer term in your career. You know, they say the most important decisions about your career are going to be made when you're not in the room. That's the same for me as it is for you, as it is for everybody else. And if this issue continues to miss awareness, it could hurt you in the future when you're not even there to defend yourself in that proverbial room when people are talking about where did they take Paul Falcone in his career. I want to share that with you, not just as your manager, but almost as a coach, if you'll allow me to. Do I have your permission to talk? Now, at that point, you can open, once you've given them that opening, they're like, yeah, I guess. What's going on? Okay, good. Now you can talk to them about anything you want because you've coached it in a way that's for their best interests in their career development. When they pull out, Miriam, the Gen Y and the Gen Z, right? Gen Y millennials are basically 45 and under. The Gen Z Zoomers are basically 25 and under. These are the most studied, what do I want to call them? Generational cohorts in world history. We know everything about them thanks to the think tanks and the PhD research
And social media and all
scientists,
the big data.
right? So when we find out what they want, survey after survey after survey, career and professional development keeps coming up as a top 3 or a top 5 element in all these different surveys. What does that mean? What does career and professional development mean? Well, it means couching things in a way that will help them see things in a much broader perspective, not making them feel judged, not making them feel like they're bad people. But you can segue that conversation into, Paul, let me tell you what I think. I want you to become a people developer, not just a salesperson. I mean, if you really want to see your career going from individual contributor like you are now into management, director, VP, senior VP, chief sales officer territory, if you really want to see that kind of trajectory for yourself, you're going to have to do it through people, not despite people.
Yeah.
And what I mean, right, and all of a sudden you can see, Miriam, now they're starting to like, oh, I never thought of that before. And it's like, yeah, now it's in their best interest to partner with their boss who's made him or herself a coach. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for sharing that. And for me, what rings through is how to help them to feel comfortable that the boss cares. So they're not just having this feedback conversation in order to punish them or bring something uncomfortable across. No, they care for the development of this person, and hence they make very clear what's in it for them. And everyone, especially those who are specifically maybe competitive or have higher aspirations in their career, they do want to know how they can even perform better, what's in it for them. And I love this as an approach, and asking for permission, as you just mentioned. And while listening to you, actually, and speaking about the different generations, so many follow-up questions come up. One is, yes, the Gen Z Y are they're into self-development. They're into this coaching. They're maybe more familiar with this language. On the other hand, especially now, is it Gen Z, the latest, the 25 and under, they're so used to asynchronous communication. They're so used to high pace, fast processes. Even when I try to watch a cartoon nowadays, this is too fast for me. I cannot follow. I get nervous. But this is what the kids grow up with today. So
Right.
how do you have, as a manager, to adjust to this generation? And then as a follow-up question, what if it turns around? So how do you deal with the boomers who might actually be in the privileged position of, I never had to explain myself. I just cashed the bonus because I'm such a good salesperson. And now you want me to be nice?
Wonderful questions. Again, excellent questions. So a couple of thoughts. As a society, we've lost the ability to sit around the campfire and have the elders pass wisdom down to the younger generations. We're just too busy, and we're looking at our phones, and we're not taking the time to do that. And the way I've always explained it when I do my management training is, listen, that's what staff meetings are about. And that's what one-on-one meetings are about. It's giving you an opportunity to pass the wisdom, to pay something forward, to teach new generations how to become better leaders. And it's not as hard as you think. You just have to make space for people to find a way to motivate themselves. I don't have to motivate you. You cannot motivate me. We can't motivate one another, not in the true sense, because all motivation is internal. So your job isn't to motivate, but your job is to create the circumstances where people can motivate themselves.
Mm.
And that's a very, very simple thought. So let's go to Gen Z for a minute, to the question before we get to the boomers. Gen Z continues to test out as the loneliest, most isolated, and most depressed generation on the planet, even more so than people in retirement homes. And the reason is because they're the first truly digital generation. They only know what it's like growing up with iPhones in their hands. They don't know a time in history before phones and computers and everything. The problem is we are social animals as human beings, and without having human connection, the electronic piece of it is not enough, which is why the isolation and the loneliness and the depression kicks in. So one of the things I think as leaders we have to talk about is, how do we help the 25 and under crowd feel more comfortable, feel more confident, even in light of the fact that COVID didn't help us with that. COVID pushed us away, basically forced us to live in our homes, which is exacerbating a serious problem to begin with.
Mm.
Now, COVID did have some positives. One of the things about studying Gen Y and Gen Z is they wanted a greater sense of work-life, family, control, balance, equilibrium. Because the just-in-time technology came out and we had things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Google Meets, all of a sudden we realized we can keep business going without having to physically be in the office. But so there's a positive, but everything has positives and negatives, right? The negative was they weren't growing up becoming best friends like I did. When I think back, some of the best friends I ever have made in my life were from my early years at Paramount Pictures. I didn't have the mentors. A mentor for me, I've had mentors in many of my jobs and many of my companies who said, let's go to lunch and let's talk about what you want to do in your career. You don't get that when you're working remotely. So again, we have to look at this and say, okay, for that particular generational cohort, how do we socialize them? How do we make it more comfortable for them to build relationships with others, to find mentors and coaches? There are apps for that. The good news is the digital technology world is coming up with all kinds of technology now to say, this is how your people can have virtual chats and how your people can have a virtual lunch together. And this is good, but it's still going to be a challenge. And we have to realize that. Apps are great, but only to a degree. An app that allows people to recognize their peers and call out the great things their peers are doing, it's wonderful. But you would never use an app to give negative information to an employee.
Mm.
God forbid, you never want to do that in an app. You've got to do that in person. So, so there's some of the positives and the negatives. When you look at the boomers now, for the most part, are probably the ones who were born towards the end of the boom are now in their late 50s, early 60s. They're only going to be in the workplace, I think, till about 2029.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're gone for the most part, assuming they retire around 65 or 67. But they want a lot of these things too. These are their years where these are the last years they're going to be working. Of course, they want to have a relationship with the person they report to. Of course, they want to feel good about their company. And again, to your point earlier, when you study the generations, they want to work, the Gen Y, Gen Z, they want to work for an ethical company doing meaningful work for a management team that cares about them personally. This is what's coming up in the top 10 in all these different surveys. What does that mean? Do they have the right? Should they have the right to say, I want to work for a company that cares about me personally? And I think the answer is yeah. I think we all should. We always should have. And of course, in light of COVID and the fact that we're all working remotely these days, it even takes on more importance, which is why you see this idea of emotional intelligence coming up on these CEO surveys. The KPMG 2024 Global CEO Survey shows that emotional intelligence among leaders is one of the top 5 things sought after by CEOs. It all makes sense. It all comes together when you look at it in this light or in this perspective of just being someone there for your employees who cares about your employees. You're going to get better performance and better retention because they want to work for you, not because they have to.
Absolutely. And I wonder whether it isn't actually a vicious circle where, of course, we want emotional intelligence. And where do you learn it if everyone just shows up with their mask and their ambition to be so professional, and behind the mask is all the fear of failure, of being fired, and with a schedule that is so full that nobody has even time to sit down and actually connect to their own emotions. How can we be empathetic towards someone else if we're not empathetic towards ourselves? And so how can we break this vicious circle?
I've got the answer. That's a great question, Miriam. I've got the answer. So here's the rule is this: what you want for yourself, give to another. It's that simple. The universe knows that you cannot give away something that you don't already have. So give it generously. When I say give people back to themselves, my standard question has always been talk to your employees and ask them the question, do you feel you're able to do your very best work every day with peace of mind? Are you able to do your very best work every day with peace of mind? That's a great question for a one-on-one, but it's also a great question for a team. And oftentimes what you'll hear is, yeah, Paul, I'm doing great. I'm at the top of Maslow's hierarchy. I am knocking it out of the park. I love this job. Okay, fine. But more often than not, what you're going to hear is, well, Miriam, I probably wouldn't have shared this, but since you're asking, no, I don't feel I can do my best work every day with peace of mind. Share with me why, Paul, if you're comfortable. And now you can get into that relationship. This is not the hardest question in the world. Now, if there's a trust issue between the employee and the manager, the employee may not feel comfortable coming forward with that, at least not initially, until they realize that the boss is changing. But that's why I say, if you're listening to this and you're a CEO or you're a business owner, understand that the frontline operational leadership muscle, that's what you want to focus on. That's where you want to build the self-awareness. That's where you want to build the self-confidence, because that's your culture. What comes from them is what you hear about on your climate surveys. It's all in the relationship with the boss. Marcus Buckingham wrote that book, First Break All the Rules. And it was the Gallup organization study of tens of thousands of workers and thousands of companies, and looking at what motivates and what demotivates. And at the very end of the book, they came up with a famous saying that we know: people join companies, but they leave managers. Meaning that they join the company because they want to be part of its success and they want that name brand on their resume. 2 years later, they're like, get me out of here. My boss is crazy. Focus on the primary profit lever in your organization, which in a knowledge-based economy is your human capital. It's your people. But the shepherd of that asset is your frontline operational leadership team. Do not leave it to them to figure this out on their own. It's too hard. And to your point, they're worried about their own jobs. They're worried about their own performance. And a lot of people who move into management never make that mind shift switch from being an individual contributor to being a leader. They stay individual contributors. They just get the title of management and they get 4 or 40 or 400 people underneath them. But they're still individual contributors in terms of their mindset, because that's what they were able to control. That's what made them successful to begin with, and they won't give it up. But if you don't help them make that mindset transition, again, to your question a little bit earlier, it's very, very difficult for people to all of a sudden become great leaders. You have to talk about it. That's why the staff meeting is important. That's why the one-on-one meetings are important. When I do executive coaching, Miriam, when I start a new assignment, the first question I ask an executive is, be honest with me. Would you want to work for you? And I get silence, and I get the eyeballs looking up to the left. And I get a very hesitant response. Well, Paul, I mean, yeah, but I'm very busy. And right away, they start getting into the making excuses. For that top sales producer, the question is, if the whole company followed your lead in terms of your behavior, your conduct, your role model experience, if the whole company followed your lead, would you be happy with where you took it?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times they'll look at me and they'll say, no, not always. I'll give you that. Okay, good. So all it takes is a change in your sponsoring thought about who you are and who you choose to be.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it.
Only.
Well, when I tell them, listen, I'll be your coach. I'll have your back. I'll support you through this. I'll make it safe for you to fix this here so that it never holds you back in your career when you're not in that proverbial room at some point in the future to defend yourself and they're talking about you. I'll make the narrative Paul and as opposed to Paul but. For you to say, I know Paul Falcone, he's a top sales producer. He's been with us for 3 years. He's fabulous. And you always want to talk with him, get to know him, pick his brain. He's going to help you be successful. That's one narrative. The other narrative is, yeah, Paul Falcone's been with us for 3 years. He's always our top performer, but you might want to be careful. He's not easy to approach. He can be very defensive. He's kind of been described as arrogant, a little bit on the toxic side. You might want to avoid him. Which narrative is going to grow your career into senior leadership? And all of a sudden they start to get it, Miriam. They're like, oh, I didn't think of it that way. And that's the aha moment. When they say, I never thought about it that way, bingo, that's good. That's what I want them to think about. And that's how I'm here as their manager to help them. Remember I said, you can't give away something that you don't already have yourself. That's how you give them self-confidence. That's how you give them career wisdom. It's one thing to say there's knowledge, but wisdom is at a higher level. Wisdom is knowledge applied. Are they able to apply their knowledge? Are they be able to use that in their lives? Because when they can figure that out at work, it carries over into their personal lives as well. They feel better about themselves. So.
Absolutely. And what it sounds like is it's purely the inner work that matters. And all these hard skills, especially nowadays where we have ChatGPT who can do most of the work if we ask the right questions and verify the answers. The inner work, the how to stay balanced, how to have the empathy, how to ask the right questions, how to also even have the self-awareness that maybe we are not easy to work with. This is what we actually need to work on, and assuming that, and you mentioned the upper leadership level, but then that's a lot of investment. It's a mindset shift, as you mentioned, that needs to happen. Where can maybe those at the lower levels start? So what is the trick if I know that I have a toxic manager and I don't want to be that person? I want to be good for my team.
Yeah,
Can we protect ourselves?
Yeah, well, having bad managers in your career is actually very important because they help you define who you are not. They almost set the broad boundaries of, well, I'm never going to do that to other people. And actually, that's important for us as we grow up. So before we say, oh, I've got a horrible manager, just understand something. That horrible manager is helping you define who you are not. And that's important for you in defining who you are because it sets those parameters for you. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is from a senior leadership perspective, looking at middle level managers, operational leaders, to the degree that you feel comfortable being the first domino, so to speak, being the first person to role model things and do things differently, there's that expression, more people are watching us than we know. And I don't say that to make people paranoid. It's just this general idea that, yeah, you're the top of the organization. You're going to be the one who sets the tone for everyone. You're the one who lets people know what's safe and what's foolish. And that's why people will, well, I'm not going to do that if my boss doesn't do it. I understand that logic, but I'm also going to tell you this, and this contradicts what I just said, but it's important. When you move into management, when you make that mind shift transition from being an individual contributor to being a leader of others, you get to create your own ecosystem. I don't care what's going on above you. I don't care bombs are going off and who's shooting and noise and rocket ship. I don't care about any of that stuff. You make it safe for your employees to do their best work every day with peace of mind. If you have 2 employees or you have 20 or you have 200, I want people to see your leadership style stand out. I want people from other divisions and other departments in the company to want to join your department because they know that working in your department is fun. People are enjoying themselves. This isn't, I know we're all overwhelmed. We're all exhausted, right? We talk about burnout, and I get that, but this is easier than we're making it, Miriam. Because we tell ourselves these narratives, as I mentioned earlier, don't recognize your employees. They have to fear you. That gets in our way of being great leaders. The reality is, to the degree that you can make yourself vulnerable and you can be the role model for your employees and talk about it, that's what the campfire is about. That's where the elders pass wisdom down to the young. And I've always said, teach what you choose to learn. You don't have to be a master of this to be able to teach it. Teach it while you're learning it yourself. That's what I've done for 3 decades. That's how I created 17 books. I'm
I
learning
get
this stuff
that.
as I go.
And I get that. And I think for me, there are few curiosities coming out because I think those who listen to this podcast are not the ones who think that, oh, you have to lead with a strong hand and everyone needs to be fearful. They're rather the opposite, right? So the audience are usually facilitators or those who have a high degree of self-awareness. And they will burn out because they care too much. They will burn out because they're having all these good conversations and they really want the team to thrive. And hence, at the end, they are squashed between maybe the upper management that does not have the same kind of empathetic, human-centered approach. So how can we protect ourselves and still show up as these leaders?
There's always one of the books I'd written was on workplace ethics. And it's this idea of where's the threshold for you, right? And yes, that idea of feeling squashed is normal. I mean, everybody feels squashed, including the CEO in a publicly traded company. They have to worry about the board of directors. I mean, they can feel squashed too. At some point, you'll know when it is really ethically the time for you to leave. But let's not use that in this example. Let's talk about how do you protect yourself when you're living in a less than perfect world. The first thing I would say is, to the degree that you can, start management training at the top, highest levels of the organization to get them on the same page. You always want that leadership alignment around these ideas. When I do training, I don't go in and train middle managers because I can train them. They're going to say, Paul, this sounds great, but you need to tell my manager because she doesn't do this, right? It's that kind of thing. You got to start at the top and work your way down. And to the degree that you can, you set the role model because people are watching you too. I'm not naive. I've worked in investment banking. I've worked in healthcare. I've worked in movie studios. These are not necessarily the kindest people in the world. Not always. But at the same time, we're all human. And we all basically have the same needs. And what I found was, when I can treat my employees a certain way and have a reputation in the company for leading in a certain way, people trusted me more. People came to me. They would make themselves vulnerable. People from other departments would come to me and say, teach me how you're doing what you're doing because I like what you're saying.
So
Because we all have that same fundamental need, Miriam, to be accepted, right? But to be able to make it better for people. No one wants to come to work and be mean. They just feel like that's how I'm treated, so that's how I'm going to treat everybody else, which is, again, understandable unless you can bring them to the wisdom that says you don't have to be this. You actually be successful in your own right, especially with your own teams and departments.
okay, and then if we don't want to preach to the converted, how do we then approach this difficult conversation with our manager, maybe, who does not take enough time, who maybe makes us feel judged, puts us under pressure, and puts us down, although we are doing a good job? So how do we do it up the hierarchical ladder?
It's much harder to do it up. That's the hardest way to do it. It's easiest to do it down. It's
Mm-hmm.
easiest to do it sideways.
Mm-hmm.
Doing it upwards, it depends. Sometimes you work for what I call proverbially the Neanderthal manager, right? The one who has no self-awareness. The expression is, if the only thing you have is a hammer everything starts to look like a nail,
Mm.
right? And that's all they know how to do is pound, 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 but there's not a lot of humanity in there. If you've tried different things and you can't really get that person to budge, because truly in your heart of hearts, they just don't have that gene in their system. They just don't have an ability to communicate well with other people. You find that you're covering for them all the time. People go to you rather than going to your boss because it's easier to come to you. You do have to make a decision. No one says you have to stay with the same company for the rest of your life. It's usually, I'm giving an extreme example, and I'm not encouraging people to leave. You should always stay and try and fix things. But that's a reality. That may be the outlier, but it's a reality to keep in mind. The other piece of it is to give the feedback loop upwards, to say, can I have your permission to speak with you about something off the record that's been bothering me, as an example? Or can I just talk to you about something that, if you don't mind, just person to person, I'd like to share with you, because it sometimes gets in my way to do my best work every day with peace of mind. And they'll say, what's up? Start using words like, I feel. There can be times when, on occasion, I've experienced, right? Don't make them feel judged. You always do this. You never do that. Don't do that. That's not going to get them anywhere. That's just going to make them self-defensive. You want to help them raise their own awareness. And if I can sit with a boss and say, there are times when, and forgive me for saying, but I almost feel like your tone of voice in public can be very reprimanding, can be very confrontational. I tend not to be a confrontational person. I think you know me well enough. I'm not a confrontational person, but I don't like being on the receiving end of that message. Can I ask something that, if there's ever a time when you feel like you do need to confront me, can we do it in private like this, as opposed to doing it in front of my peers? Because I feel like there's a public humiliation that goes on with that, and I prefer to avoid that. Now, that's a nice way of saying it. You've thrown it out there. Now, people are going to say, well, wait, Paul, that sounds good, but what happens if I get fired? That's the question. They're going to go back to the ethics on it, Miriam. It's like, at what point does it become where enough is enough? This has happened to me enough times where I'm not going to do this anymore. People will look at you. Bullies, you know, the story about bullies is, take the schoolyard example. When you're a young child, they push the kids up against the fence. The kids who don't fight back, they keep pushing. The kids who push back, they usually will leave them alone and go find someone else. I think that's important in the workplace. You have to have teeth. You have to be able to push back on your boss. So if one element is you need to know when it's time to leave, fine. Another element may be you need to know when enough is enough, and you need to put it on the line. That's fine. That's a second. Let me give you a third. The third one is, don't ever allow it to get there in the first place. Don't let that bully push you against the fence. You have to be able to push back and say, I don't appreciate how that was handled. I don't treat you that way. I would never treat you that way. Now, that's primarily because you're my boss, but I have to tell you, I wouldn't treat you that way if you were my peer or you were my subordinate either.
And that's important. And you would say this immediately when it comes up, right after the incidents, then hopefully one-on-one,
Yes.
in private, asking for a moment to speak.
Right. What are your options? Say nothing and let it fester. Option two, say it in real time when it really happens, which I think is the most effective. Third option is let it build and build and build until you realize, well, I'm going to say it because I don't really care at this point, because if I don't say it, I'm going to leave anyway. And the fourth one is tender your notice and resign. Look at it on the spectrum and say, where do I choose to be in all this stuff? This is not the last time you're going to have a really tough boss. I hate to say it. You're going to have many of them. When I look at my career, I've had 8 leaders who played significant roles in my career. And 4 to 4.5 of them were wonderful, but 3 to 3.5 of them were not very good. I still had to be me, despite the fact that I was working for people who I didn't really care for or didn't respect. I had a manager one time who said to me, I'm concerned about the relationships you have with your clients. And I said, I love my clients. Why would you feel that way? And she said, that's the problem. I don't want them to love you. I want them to fear you. I didn't have anything to come back with. I don't want to be feared. That's not who I am. I knew that relationship would not last very long, because if she was looking for someone who is a fear monger, I was not the right guy for that job. You have to know when to say it's not the right time for me to stay at a particular company. It was a good company. I had a very high position. Doesn't matter. You have to know yourself. You have to be true to yourself. So you go back to that self-defense mechanism, is talk yourself through this stuff, coach yourself through this stuff, do a chat GPT search if it makes you feel better, and say, how do I approach my boss when I'm frustrated with my boss's behavior and conduct? But find a way to make it comfortable for you. That's the key, Miriam. You can't just use my words. You have to customize this so it fits your personality and your style to be able to have the strength and the bravery to talk to your boss about something that doesn't sit well with you and that makes you uncomfortable. And I think you can find that, but better that than quitting outright. And the boss says, well, I didn't even know you weren't even happy. Don't do that. That's not fair to them. But more importantly, it's not fair to you. Figure out how to figure out how to fix this. And then if you choose to leave, you can, but fix the problem first. Don't run from the problem.
Yeah. And I think the key from what I noticed and also hear in your words is not to make the other person feel judged and taught, especially if it's someone higher the hierarchy. Nobody wants to be told what to do or how they misbehave. But I think approaching it with curiosity and then avoiding the blaming part of it. And I'm very curious at the moment in the entire field of nonviolent communication, where how can you communicate in a way that you don't attack or blame or shame the other person? And one big word that I stumble across very often is, I feel disrespected, which sounds like a feeling, but it's actually a judgment of the other person not respecting me. And this in turn makes the other person feel defensive very quickly because, yeah, they have all the reasons to become defensive because they just have been judged.
I would totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So how can we, and when I shared this recently in a workshop with corporates, they were curious. And then the first question was like, but what's an alternative to say that I feel disrespected? Because I did feel disrespected. And then I wonder, in the corporate world, how often or how honest can we be about our feelings before getting dismissed and get over it? You're overly sensitive.
You're overly sensitive, right? That's always what you're going to hear. You're being too sensitive. Okay, so there's a few things. The two key words to all of this, feeling and perception. Feelings are not right or wrong. They just are, right? No one's going to tell you that you don't have the right to feel that way. It's just how you feel. Same thing with the word perception. And I'll get to that one in a minute. But let me talk about when you're talking to your boss. If you were to say, sometimes the way you address me in public makes me feel, I don't want to say disrespected because I don't want to make any drama of this, but it makes me feel judged. It makes me feel like I'm not doing a good job, and you tend to call that out in front of other people, and I feel embarrassed in front of my peers. I would just ask you, if you wouldn't mind, and talk to you about this, could you hold these kinds of meetings with me in private as opposed to calling me out in person in front of others? Because it makes me feel embarrassed and it makes me feel humiliated. What are your thoughts? You can say that because you're being honest now. You're not saying you make me feel disrespected. You're saying it in a little bit of a kinder way. It's the same message, but it's all about how I'm perceiving what you're doing. And I think that makes it better. Now, let me go to the flip side for a minute, Miriam. When I'm talking to managers about how to talk to their employees, like that top sales producer who doesn't play well with anyone else, holding them accountable for their own perception management is a way to have that conversation. You can talk to someone about, they used to call them public relations firms, PR firms. Now they call them perception management firms. It's the same thing, because perception is reality until proven otherwise. And if you don't mind my saying, Paul, I think you've got a perception problem on your hands. I think that your peers tend to avoid you rather than come to you. And that can hold you back in your career. If you're not the one they're going to, senior leadership, wherever you are, at whatever company, isn't necessarily going to look at you and say, that's the one we need to promote to VP. or senior VP. You've got to make it more welcoming. Now, I'm here to help you. I would be happy to coach you through this and make it safe for you to do this right here, right now, at this point in your career, so it doesn't ever hold you back. But even if you choose not to allow me to be your coach, that's okay. But I'm still going to hold you accountable for your own perception management. And what I mean by that is it's not others being too sensitive. It's not how you see this. It's about how your actions and behaviors are coming across in the eyes of others. That's how I'm going to hold you accountable. And that needs to be fixed, because this is a once in a career conversation. I'm not going to keep having this conversation over and over again. I don't believe in that. But if you can't turn this around, I'm ultimately going to have to consider whether you're the right person to be on this team.
Yeah.
Now, that's a tough conversation if this is the person who's bringing in 60% of your revenue every month. Again, on the leadership side, you've got to make an ethical decision here. Do you do this proactively? Do you wait till you've had enough and you finally have to have this one-on-one meeting? Or do you just go out and fire the person? You've got different options, but we're just looking at the same issues in a mirror.
Yeah.
At what point do you give real-time feedback, up, down, or sideways? And how would you want to be? There's your question. How would you feel if you're on the receiving end of that message? Is it a reasonable message? Is it an emotional message? Is it a helpless message? Is it a strong message? Where would you want to be? Practice it on yourself in your head. You have to know how to draw those lines. Otherwise, people can take advantage. You've got to have, again, leadership offense and leadership defense. This is the defensive side. You've got to know how to protect yourself.
And how would all of this look like when you come in as an external? So in the audience, there are many facilitators. They come in working with a management team or a team for a certain amount of time, maybe one workshop, maybe an entire project. How would you advise them to have these conversations or this feedback to the individuals who either might behave in a condescending way towards them or other team members?
Yeah, that's exactly where I am right now. I've been doing this for the last 2 years, and I'm enjoying it immensely. And I do think there's a natural level of respect that comes in for someone from the outside because of their level of expertise or whatever it happens to be. Yet at the same time, yeah, sometimes you're going to get people who say, this is a bunch of baloney. I don't believe any of this. This isn't going to work here. This isn't how I was raised. Everyone's being too sensitive, blah, 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 blah. There have been situations, not many, but there have been some where it's kind of an outright challenge. How do you handle that? My answer to that is very simple. I tell them, you guys, this is my game, okay? Not yours, with all due respect. I'm the one in charge in this for right now. So I need you to kind of hold off on any preconceived thoughts, give me a chance, and keep open to the fact that this may be the most important training you've ever gone through in your life.
I would feel resistance towards that, I must say, to be told that.
Okay. But again, I'm the outside consultant. If they're gonna keep barking at me, they're gonna keep challenging me. There's nothing that says I have to work here and continue doing this. That's why I like being a consultant. At some point, I've got to put them back in their place. And I will tell them, you guys, this is my game. It's not yours, not right now. I need you to be open to this. I need you to hear what I happen to say. If after we've gone through this, you feel like, no, this is a terrible waste of your time, I'll apologize. That's not the point. The point is this could be the best training you've ever gone through in your career, because it could be a game changer in terms of how you see yourself and how you see others. The reason why I'm here is to raise that level of awareness among the leadership team, not necessarily you guys in this room, but the whole team, which I will be doing in different meetings. So I need you to give me that benefit of the doubt. Will you do that? And at that point, they'll usually just shush and they'll like, okay, I'll listen, because they have to. And then my job is to pierce their heart, right? My job is to get them to understand that there are certain things. I tell them, look, I'm not telling you to knock down the house. Just look at the house, look at the foundation, and see if there are a couple of bricks in there that are kind of falling apart. They're kind of wobbly. If you can replace just a few strategic bricks, you could strengthen that foundation and get that house going for another 100 years. So it's evolution, it's not revolution. I'm not telling them to change everything about themselves and do it overnight. But what I am saying is, come on, you guys, this is for your own career and professional development. That's why I'm here. Let's look at identifying what those 2 or 3 bricks are and when this training is over, I'm going to recommend you talk to your manager about what those bricks are and what they can be and what they can look like if you do them differently. And if you can come away from that, you'll be a stronger player as a result of this training.
Mm.
So again, an appeal to career and professional development, but I have no problem drawing the line. If I'm going to keep getting people nipping at my heels, I will shut that down very, very quickly. I have a lot of self-confidence, Miriam. I do. Not everyone has the same self-confidence.
I have no doubt in that.
Yeah, but we all have our own styles. And my style is, at some point, you're going to know leadership defense, boom, I just drew the line.
And
now, if you don't want to be here, you can leave, and I'll tell you the owner of the company that you decided you didn't want to sit in on this, and you can deal with him or her about that. But while you're in this room, I'm the one in control. You have to have an element in your mindset about that. Otherwise, it can get awkward, especially if you keep getting challenged.
I totally understand. And I think, as you say, there's a limit. So, and I was just wondering where would you draw that line? Because I think there's a certain degree of discomfort, of rejection, because it is a vulnerable place to get there. People who sit in management training might believe, why am I sitting here in the first place? I'm a good manager. Who says that I'm not? And I do get that when I train senior managers in facilitation. Oh, I do workshops all the time. Why do I have to sit in a facilitation training? And then, yes, there might be sometimes even aggressive or reject me, but it has nothing to do with me or the content. It's just their own fears. And then I think it's one way to just come back with answer to strengths with strengths and to make it a battle, or to maybe connect to the softer side. So what is the need? Where is the fear come from? How can we handle that?
So for me, Miriam, I come from total transparency. I do believe that we should be sitting around the campfire and talking more and passing wisdom down. So I share the full perspective. I talk to the managers and I say, look, everybody, the reason why we're here isn't because you've been through other trainings and why do we need to go through more? Just bear with me. This is a muscle that you're trying to hone. Okay. For everybody who's sitting in the front row, you guys, you're the best. You're the ones who come here and want to learn. And I know it because I've been training and writing books for decades. But when I go to a training, I sit in the front row because there's always something else I can learn. Now, you guys in the back, you lose, and then they laugh. I'm like, I know what you're thinking. I want to be able to get out of here, and I want to be able to get out of here quick. I understand that, but you're going to have to give me the benefit of the doubt because we're all here to build muscle. And leadership muscle is not a one and done. Leadership muscle is like going to the gym. You got to keep going back, keep trying out new machines, keep trying to re-identify and reinvent yourself in terms of what's going to work best for you at this point in your career, what's going to work best for your team, what's going to work best for your manager. But this is about raising awareness. Too many of us go through our careers like a cork on a wave. We just bob up and down. Depending on where the waves are going, we get splashed around, pushed around, and everything else. Part of this is using a metaphor, you guys, of going up to that 30,000 foot level. My job is to get you up to where the airplanes are flying, and I want you to be able to look down on what's going on. You can see it more clearly. You have a longer vantage point. You can see ahead much more clearly. Now, we have to come back down into the weeds because that's where we live and work every day. I get that. But from time to time, you all need to take yourself up to that 30,000 foot view, no matter what it is, personal life, politics, work life, relationships, and see where things are. Because if you only live in the weeds, you're going to get banged around all the time and you're going to feel like you're reacting to everything. My goal for you is to help you be the cause of what's going on in your career, not at the effect of everything around you, but you have to see it clearly. Now, once you're done with that exercise, which is what this training is all about, is getting you to that 30,000 foot level, the end, we're going to come back down to the weeds. You can go back to your office or back to your shop floor and do whatever work you need to get done. But you've got to see it outside of the normal everyday perspective. And that's what I'm here to help you do, is to build that muscle for your own career and professional development. That message, they will listen. That is not a message that people are going to say, oh, this is baloney. They may come in thinking this is a bunch of baloney vorscht. Yeah. But the point is, they need to understand that the company is paying for someone like me to come in for a reason. And I tell them what that is. That
Mm.
what I've heard is that you have strong teams and you've got good tenure, but there's not a lot of cross collaboration going from department to department to department. Would you guys agree with that?
So,
Is that a
yeah.
primary concern here as I've heard it? And now we get them talking about things.
So what I
Um,
hear is that you start by creating kind of or acknowledge the fact that some of them don't want to be there and that this is okay. So already kind of calming down the nervous system. Um, and then also pointing at the elephant in the room and stating the truth. Okay, this is why we're really here for. This is what's happening. And then basically confronting them with this maybe difficult truth, but then at least it's out and everyone can work on that.
Absolutely. Well,
Mm.
I like to make them laugh because that's my personality. And I'll say I've seen managers throughout my whole career who say, I don't need training. I've been doing this for 20 years. And
Mm.
what I'm thinking is, you've only managed 1 year, you've just repeated it 20 times,
Mm.
but you've never really learned anything along the way. You guys, this is a chance to you to hone that muscle, build that muscle.
Yeah.
And I'm here right now to make it safe for you to do so.
Yeah.
So that kind of, again, most people are not going to still fight it at that point. I've never gotten
Mm.
to a point where people were still resistant. At that point, they're laughing a little bit. They're like, yeah, I get it. Okay, so what do you got, Falcone?
Mm.
And now mentally, I know that they're kind of like more open.
Yeah.
But the transparency, that full transparency of why I'm here, this is what I'm hearing, and you tell me. Sometimes I'll say, okay, you guys, this idea of cross-departmental communication, collaboration, whatever you want, pollination, whatever you want to call it. Where are you guys? Scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you're the best you could possibly be, 1 being you're horrible. Give me a number. And
Mm.
4, 6, 5. Okay, good. So now I got it, heard it. We've all heard the same thing. Why are we a 5? The average you're telling me is 5. Why? Now I can get them talking again. Well, we're 5 because we don't know. Good. Now we go through that for a few minutes. Then the next question is, what would make us a 10? And in that gap analysis, that's the takeaway. That's the
Mm.
action plan. Now, the only thing I have left to do, because I'm doing this at the beginning of a workshop, at the end of the workshop, I'm going to say, okay, now that we've identified what the action plan is, I need to know who's going to be responsible for making this work.
Mm.
Because it's one thing to come in here and complain, thank you, but that's not why I'm here. It's another thing to say, we've identified the gaps, we're committed to fixing them. How are we going to do this? Who is going to do this? And what it's going to look like? Because
Mm.
I want the business owner to know 3 months from now, man, they really got something out of this. And I'll tell them, you guys, that's how I make a living. So you better make me look good. I joke with them about that, but Miriam, that is the truth. It's
Mm.
not enough to come in here and say there's a problem. It's enough for me to get in there to say, what's the problem? What's the degree of it? Once we know what it looks like, who's going to take responsibility for fixing it? And how are we going to do it collectively as a team?
Yeah.
That's the real value in doing the training.
And have each other's back.
And have each other's back. Correct.
From your experience, what brings a workshop to fail?
If there's a lack of transparency, first of all, they're not going to believe it. You have to be able to make yourself vulnerable to a degree as a trainer, right? You have to make yourself vulnerable as a manager. You should be able to make yourself vulnerable as an employee in a healthy sense. If people like those TEDx talks, one of the top 10 TEDx talks of all times is on the importance of vulnerability.
Mm.
And it's by Brene Brown, correct. University of Texas at Austin. Listen to that. Play that with your employees. Watch it together as a team. When it's done, 18 minutes later, you can say, what does that look like for us? How
Mm.
good are we at this? Scale of 1 to 10, you guys, where are we? And you can get them talking about things, but you've got to teach managers how to do this. The manager who says, I don't have time to do this, I'm too busy, is way too deep into individual contributor mindset. They're right, they are too busy, but it's never going to get any better, right? As the economy changes, the world changes, the technology changes, the globalization changes, you're never going to have time. So take that off the table. Not looking at it like, do I have enough time? Think about it in terms of, what can I swap out in terms of what I'm doing?
Am I
Because
spending the time on the right things?
you're spending your time on the right
Mm.
things, because the return on investment you're going to get by raising your team's awareness of what's going on by helping them become more emotionally intelligent, by helping them think more in terms of achievement. I can't tell you how many times I go into companies and their departments are thinking commas. And I tell them, don't think comma, think bullet. Let me give you an example. The comma is someone who says, I do phones, comma, filing, comma, correspondence, comma. I don't care about commas. That's your job description. That's nothing. I want to know bullets. What are you doing in terms of increasing revenue, decreasing expenses, saving time, increasing customer satisfaction? And my job as your manager is to help you quantify that for your resume and for your LinkedIn profile and for your annual self review. I want them thinking in terms of achievements because they're going to cut through all the nonsense and get to what they need done. Now, well, Paul, my employees are hourly, they're junior, they're not necessarily career focused. Change your question, but think the same way. What's your superpower? What makes you stand out among your peers? Why is it a better place at this organization for your having worked here over the past year? Get them thinking about that. Don't make them think commas. That's why I say that's not going to take too much of your time. But boy, that's going to give you a good return on your investment because you're changing their mindset to think in terms of achievements, to think in terms of self-awareness, to think in terms of bringing out the best in their peers. One other thought on this one, Miriam. I had written an article for SHRM on values-based leadership, and it's on practically all of my books. But I learned it from the general manager of the Nickelodeon animation studio. And Mark Taylor was his name. He and I are still great friends. But what Mark was a legend in the business. People left Disney and they left DreamWorks and they left Warner Brothers Animation because they wanted to work at Nickelodeon because they wanted to work for Mark. Everyone knew that at Nick, you can do your best work with peace of mind. And Mark would spend his first day in new hire orientation, usually 15 or 20 people sitting in the large, conference room. But we'd sit along a long table and he would say, I want to hear about you. I want to get to know you guys. I will know you all by name. But tell me about yourself. Tell me what brought you here to Nickelodeon. And they'd all talk and we'd spend an hour doing that. And then Mark would, at the end of that, say, you guys, I want you to know a little bit more about me, but I want you to know about our grade 8 rules. And you're going to hear about them when you start. Mark's grade 8, but everyone knows what they are. And they are more important than what's in your employee handbook and in the policy and procedure manual and in the collective bargaining agreement and in the code of ethics. I want you to know these 8 things so that you know what's expected of you. And the first one is always bring out the best in those you work for and work with and make people know that you have their back. And that would be his first one. And then he'd go through his others. But the bottom line is what he was basically saying is these are my expectations of you. And as long as you understand what these expectations are and you strive to meet them, you're going to be fine. But understand something, if you don't, there will be consequences. I hold everyone accountable just like I do myself and everyone else. To me, it's this idea of having an iron hand and a velvet glove. You still need to have the iron hand, but it's how you say it. It's how you approach it. It's how you make people see themselves as part of a team where they can motivate themselves. And everyone does better because now you're thinking about achievement mindset and you're thinking about otherness. You're thinking about selfless leadership. That creates a whole different environment than you're going to find in a lot of companies out there. And wow, isn't it wonderful if you can make that maybe not necessarily happen in your entire organization, but happen in terms of your department or your group, your team, your division, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, and if you're hiring the right people, they are joining in order to grow. So they want to have the challenges that help them grow.
Correct. Agree.
What remains your number one facilitation challenge after so many books and years?
I don't really consider it a challenge. Sometimes I have groups that are very, very quiet. And no matter how I try and get them to talk or laugh or engage, they're just so painfully shy. You can tell a lot about the culture right there that people aren't talking to one another. So what I've always done with that is the scale of 1 to 10. Okay, everyone, I want you to participate to the degree that you're comfortable, but tell me on a scale of 1 to 10, when it comes to blank, fill in whatever the blank is, where are we as an organization? And maybe where are you as a department? Just give me a number. And I figure if I could just pull out them to say 6, at least they said something. And then from there, we can start to hear other people's numbers. And then from there, it's a little safer for them to come out of their shell. And then from there, we can say, why are we a 6? Why are we a 7? Why did that number come to your mind? Because it's a relative number. The number doesn't mean anything, but why does that number mean something to you?
Mhm.
And then you try and get them to talk. So I'd say my challenge right now is when I go into a team that's talkative, they're laughing at the time I walk in. I love it. That's for me. That's my comfort zone. When I go into a team where they're all looking at their desk or they're looking at their shoes, they
Mm.
don't want to look at anyone else, peers or anyone. That's going to be my biggest challenge. And I want them to enjoy the training. I mean, it's fun stuff. It's good stuff. This is not meant to be punitive in any way. It's not meant to make it harder for you. It's meant to make your life easier.
Yeah.
But I try and get that mindset change in them so they can see it in that light, because they may never have thought of it
Mm.
that way.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I like the strategy of, okay, just making it comfortable, getting them to ease by sharing just a little bit. And also, I can imagine that if someone says 6 and sees, oh, they're more saying the same number, I feel less alone. So you create a little bit of safety and then sharing, oh, is your 6 the same as the other 6? And then you
Right,
have some meat to work with. Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, exactly. I do think storytelling is kind of the key. When I was in college, I went to UCLA and I had a summer job for 4 summers that was always waiting for me. And I was a tour guide at Universal Studios. So if anyone had ever been on the Studios tour guide, the tour, I was the person on the tram with the microphone. And I did that for 4 summers in a row. And it was the funnest job. But, sometimes it was really, really hot. And sometimes the shark was broken, so they weren't going to see the shark. And sometimes the lines were very long. And you were dealing with people who would say, listen, I spent a lot of money and I'm pretty frustrated right now. And that goes on in theme parks throughout the world. What I found was once they were on the tour, I could make them feel comfortable with themselves. I can
Mm.
tell them stories that would make them laugh. When they were looking at an old building, I could tell them the stories about what was filmed on that building. And do you remember in this movie, or do you remember on this TV series, or do you watch the streaming show of blah, blah, blah? When they're looking at it, it takes them out of all it's so hot, it's so crowded, the shark didn't work. They're in the moment. Training for me needs to be in the moment. I
Mm.
want people that oftentimes when I give them an example of a tough conversation, and we're using that as a training topic, they're thinking of the worst situation they've ever had in their career. And that's what they filter it through. Now, 99% of the time, it's not going to be that bad, but the human brain just goes through, I did that once and it didn't work. And then they're going to come back and challenge me on that because in that worst case scenario, it didn't work for them. But I'll say, let's talk about how it could have worked. What do you think now that we've talked about these things? What could you maybe have done differently?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it's like there's a calm that comes. They can breathe out, they can exhale. They're like, yeah, maybe I could have learned something from that I missed at the time. It missed awareness at the time. But if I ever had to do it again, I'd know how to handle myself in that situation. That's where I want them to get.
Thank you. And I love the anecdote of you being a tour guide in the theme park, because for me, this is an area where we need facilitation and often it gets forgotten. So how to help this grumpy client who has been standing in line for ways too long without water in the heat or even in the rain, how to get them into the moment, and how to create maybe even a little bit of a community group feeling within this group who will be joining you on the tour, right? And that's an art.
And they're all strangers. But the funny thing
Yeah.
is, you can go into a company and, like that example I gave you, where
Mhm.
they're all looking down and they won't
Yeah.
look at each other, they're strangers too, because the
Yeah.
company didn't do a good job of bonding them and bringing them together. Again, a culture I have to respect. I can't change everything as a trainer. But even one other thing, think about what your favorite tools are and give them tools they can use.
Mm.
If I have just a minute, Miriam, I'll explain. When I'm doing the management training and I'm giving them the example of that salesperson who's the top performer, but is difficult to deal with. And there's that talk about the most important decisions in your career will be made when you're not in the room. And, I want to help you influence that, what they're saying about you in the future. That's fine. But a tool that I teach them is just on a piece of paper, draw a circle and cut it in half. And on the top half of the circle, write performance. And on the bottom half of the circle, write the word conduct or behavior. Whichever word you like is fine. But you can talk to someone using a simple visual. and say, Paul, on the performance side, at the top of the circle, you're doing great. You consistently bring in 60 to 70% of our branch's revenue month after month. You're doing great. That's not why we're here. Okay, I want to continue. I want to see you continue doing that. I'm here to support you in any way I can. But I'm here to talk to you about the bottom half of the circle. The bottom half of the circle, when it comes to your conduct or your behavior, you're not really meeting expectations there. And let me explain why. If you were stronger in that area, people would be seeking you out for help. People would be looking to you for guidance. People would laugh more when they're dealing with you. People would want to come and see you, not because they have to, but because they want to. You'd be the role model who could replace me when I step aside. You're not quite there yet, but I have to hold you accountable for the full circle. Everyone gets held accountable for the full circle. So despite how well you're doing in the top half of the circle, if I had to give you a performance review right now, you'd only partially be meeting expectations. You wouldn't fully be meeting expectations. But I'm calling you here now because I want to talk to you about how to strengthen the muscle that builds the bottom half of that circle. Because if you can get as strong in the bottom half of that circle as you are in the top, your career goes nowhere but up. But I don't want to see this hold you back. So let's talk about it. And now, again, a simple tool, piece of paper, cut a circle in half, but you'd be surprised. The managers come back 3 weeks later and say, oh my goodness, I tried that with someone, it worked. I don't know why it always seems to work, Miriam, but it works. It's like people can hold that in their understanding. And it's a very visual way for people to see, no matter how well you're doing on performance, that does not excuse the fact that you're not easy to work with.
Yeah.
And the form does all the talking you need. So you don't have to make them feel judged or make them feel bad about themselves. But you can very objectively say, I need you to be as strong in the bottom half as you are in the top half of that circle. And voila, it seems to work.
Yeah. And I'm very curious because what I would be afraid of in this area would be sarcasm. Oh, I don't want people to come with me to question, to laugh at my jokes. Then my calendar is even fuller. I'm performing already well, and I'm performing even well if people don't like me. Right? So this kind of sarcasm to then push it into the ridiculous.
I've never had that. It could happen. You're right. I've never had that. Usually when you're having a career one-on-one, they're listening. Even if they're cocky and arrogant and think that no one could touch them because I've been here for 30 years, or because my father is the CEO, or because I'm the sales producer. When you're having these kinds of conversations with people, they tend to take it seriously. But as a trainer, I was just going to say, as a trainer, give them the tools. When they walk out with nothing from my training, I want them to walk out with what I call the performance conduct circle, because they can use that. And it gives you automatic credibility as a trainer to say they got something there. 2 years later, they remember the circle. They still use the circle. That's, again, going to give you an advantage and a step up, a leg up in this whole process of you yourself being a stranger, going in to meet a crowd of people who you don't know, but gaining some kind of immediate credibility and traction with them.
Yeah, thank you. One final question to close with.
Please.
What would you have liked to know before when you just got started?
That I could just be myself. I too was telling myself narratives about, because I started in training. I was working for a recruiting firm, a headhunting firm, and I was their director of sales. And that was I got that job pretty quickly. I started with them as a headhunter. They promoted me into the sales training, because they realized I was kind of good at that and I loved it. But it was a newly created position, but I was afraid. Call it imposter syndrome, call it whatever you want. I was afraid to really, truly be myself. Here I am 3 decades later, and I am so myself. It is what it is. I don't care anymore, but I've been through so much more. As an earlier career person, I didn't know what I didn't know. You come across as what do they call it? The unconscious incompetent. I'm not even aware of what I don't know, right? And then sooner or later you become the conscious incompetent, where you realize a lot that you don't know. But then it starts to change. And at the end, you become the conscious competent, right? You know what you're doing. No one's going to tell me this better. In my mind, I could literally say, I've written 17 books on this, so don't even bother. I would never say that. But you have a certain level of confidence that career brings with it. And that includes the scars that we get along the way, because we do make mistakes and they do hurt, but we do learn from them. And the bottom line is, I'm not saying fake it till you make it, but what I am saying is be your authentic self. Just be you. Don't tell yourself all the narratives. If your style is you like to laugh a lot, that's good. If your style is you don't like to laugh a lot, that's good. There's no right or wrong. You just have to know who you are. And I think as long as that sincerity is coming across, people will respect you. People will trust you. That comes naturally when they feel like you are trusting and respectful of them. So that's why I say, teach what you choose to learn, right? You don't have to have mastery in order to teach it. You just have to give it away, and give it away in a spirit of selflessness. Give it away in a sense of making the world a better place. If that's the only way you're looking at your life and your career, you're going to go very, very far, because people are going to recognize that. And this idea of giving people back to themselves is really that sense of, you're wanted here. I appreciate you. I like working with you. I admire the work that you do. You give people that feeling and build their self-confidence, you're going to be their favorite trainer they've ever had, and they'll remember you for that. But it has to come from sincerity. But keeping it that simple, that's the wisdom. Forget all the knowledge, forget everything you learned in school about the 5 steps to this and that. Just be yourself. And to the degree that you can do that, you're going to cut through all the nonsense and go much further in your career than you otherwise might have expected.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Beautiful. Thank you, Paul.
My pleasure, Miriam. This is wonderful. And thank you for introducing me to your audience.